Part 1. What is aperture? Aperture is the size of the opening in the lens. When you take a photo with your camera, a hole opens up that allows your camera's image sensor to catch a glimpse of the scene you're wanting to capture. The aperture that you set impacts the size of that hole. The larger the hole, the more light that gets in when the shutter is open. The smaller the hole, less light for the same amount of time. This is a 50mm Nikon lens open to its maximum aperture of 1.8. Letting in more light means you can photograph in lower light and still have photographs that are relatively blur-free. In addition to letting in more light, a large aperture shortens the area that is in focus at a given distance. Large apertures give you, the photographer, some creative control as to how much of your image is in focus. This region that is in focus is also called the depth of field. This photograph was taken with a 200mm lens at f2.8. The distance is approximately 20 yards. Notice how the birdhouse is in sharp focus, along with the surrounding bark and some of the moss that's hanging from the tree. However, everything in the distance is out of focus. The out of focus background just turns into a wash of color, directing the eye towards that which is in focus. Short depth of field may not always work in our favor. Take a look at this macro photograph. Here the plane of focus is less than 1/4 of an inch. Look closely at the picture of this orange flower. The stamen in the center is in perfect focus. However, the petals at the closer edge are out of focus, so are the petals at the farthest edge. The depth of field of this photograph is too shallow to encompass the entire flower. Here's that same 50mm lens again. This time, the aperture is closed all the way down to 22, the smallest setting that the lens has. A very small aperture setting will allow very little light in when the shutter opens. To get a proper exposure, shutter speeds will have to be lengthened. The longer shutter speeds run the risk of inducing motion blur into your photograph. The advantage of a very small aperture is that you have a large depth of field. In this photograph, the camera is focused on the main structure of the pier, the one with the pelican sitting on top. Note that the near pilings are in focus as well as the buildings on the horizon. The pilings in the front are no more than 10 meters distant. However, the buildings on the horizon are several miles away. This combination of f-stop and focal length give you a tremendous depth of field, not uncommon for most point-and-shoot cameras. Not only does depth of field change with f-stop setting, it also changes with focal length. As a general rule, the shorter the focal length of the lens, the longer the depth of field. Simply stated, a lens with a 10mm focal length will have a much larger depth of field than a lens with a 200mm focal length, at the same f-stop setting. This photograph was taken with a Nikon D90 DSLR and a wide-angle 10mm lens. The combination of the wide-angle lens and the high f-stop have given me a tremendous depth of field. As indicated on the left, my hand is less than 18 inches from the camera and is in sharp focus. The depth of field extends from my fingertips all the way out to the clouds in the distant horizon. Part 2. Shutter speed. Shutter speed is most basically defined as the amount of time in seconds light is allowed to enter the camera. Shutter speed not only controls the amount of light that enters the camera, but also the amount of blur that enters your image due to motion of the camera and of the subject. This can be a very powerful tool in the creative process, allowing the photographer to control the amount of motion and energy in the shot, or to remove motion blur completely and freeze a slice of time. Time comes to a halt in the photograph of this seagull. The shutter speed, set at 1/750th of a second, freezes all movement in this photo. On the other hand, this 6-second long exposure of this clock face shows a ghostly second hand that briefly pauses at each tick of each second. Here, this 1-second exposure makes the train appear to be traveling at a high rate of speed. However, it is only moving at a walking pace. Under normal circumstances, you should maintain a shutter speed above 1/60th of a second. This will help to reduce any undesirable blur that's caused by movement of the camera. Longer shutter speeds will require some type of support to steady the camera. Shutter speeds that extend beyond 1/60th of a second will usually require some type of support. If you'll remember from our first class, we discussed a tripod, possibly using a bag of rice, bracing yourself properly, and other methods. Your choice of support will depend on your situation and how long you plan on leaving the shutter open. However, I do recommend a tripod for any exposures that are going to take longer than 1/3 of a second. Part 3. ISO. ISO, in its most basic understanding, is how sensitive your camera is to light. However, it's not quite that simple. It also involves how much noise your sensor will generate as it becomes more sensitive to light. Noise in digital photography appears as a grain or splotches on a digital image. Take a look at this image. It looks like the guitar player is playing in a snowstorm. This is digital noise. The light sensitivity setting of the camera has been pushed well beyond the tolerable noise level.